All right. So at this point, I'm very excited to have Harland Patch with us this morning. Harland is a professor at the Penn State University in the Department of Entomology, where he researches and teaches, also conducts outreach programs in pollinator education. He's part of the Penn State University Center for Pollinator Research, one of many centers there on campus, a really robust team of professionals working together in pollinator education and research. And he's going to talk about some of his research today, how he and others conducted research there on site and then used that to develop the new pollinator and bird garden at the Arboretum at Penn State, where they're actually taking those plants and those practices and putting them in the ground for others to see and learn from. The Penn State is going to be the host for the International Conference on Pollinator Biology, Health, and Policy in 2023. So if you get a chance to come to Happy Valley, to Penn State, to that conference, you'll be able to see these gardens in practice and learn from all the work that's happening there at Penn State. And I did put on that Learn With Us tab, I put links to Harland's research, the Arboretum, and that conference there coming to Penn State. So Harland, so happy to have you with us this morning to teach us more about those plants and those design elements that are important for developing pollinator gardens.
Thank you, Denise. Does that look good?
That's great. Thank you.
That's great. So as Denise was saying, my talk today is going to be about the research we have done here and elsewhere in the world, you'll see, and how we use that research to inform how we're going to create pollinator landscapes. So this is really a 30,000-foot view of how we think and where the science is leading us to think about these landscapes. I know others in this series are going to talk about very practical applications. What plants to choose was always very exciting, and sort of how to manage the landscape. But this is really about where pollinators are in the world today, what we've learned from the science over the last 10, 15 years, and how you can actually use that knowledge to understand the landscapes you're in and engage them and understand what you're actually seeing in your garden or your landscape you're altering. I'll also say that there is a lot of research in this talk, and I put on each page where I do have research, our own here or elsewhere, the references, because I do encourage people to look at those references if you want to get really into the gory nitty-gritty details of science. So let me start you off with really what the problem is. I'm going to talk about for honeybees really quickly. Of course, they're a managed species. They're very important for agriculture. But there are multiple things that are problems for them. For honeybees specifically, and not for necessarily other pollinators, you have things like varroa mites and management practices. But for many other species of pollinator, you have issues like introduced viruses or viruses and diseases generally. Of course, issues surrounding pesticide use, which is very prominent in the media, is very important, and certainly in certain places. There's global change, climate change in different parts of the world affecting people differently. But what I'm really going to focus on is landscape. I think one of the most significant things for all pollinators, beyond honeybees, beyond just bees, to all the pollinators and many species on this planet, is just landscape change and alteration. So this is basically the challenge. This is actually in Munster in Germany. You can look at this picture, and I defy you to find a flower. Of course, pollinators depend on flowers for their nutrition. So they use pollen for their protein and lipids, and they use nectar for their carbohydrate source. It's very important for their lives, because it's the only thing they eat, that they have those flowers in the landscape. When you have a landscape like this, and many parts of the world look like this, we find that there is a decline in floral diversity and floral abundance in many parts of the year. Now, that might not be the case in the Central Valley, might not be the case in somewhere like Yosemite National Park, but is the case in some place like the Central Valley of California, or in Northern Europe in this case. So what we basically see in many parts of the world is we have species loss, we have decline in abundance of the species that are there, and the species that are there tend to be quite similar between places. So this is not that there's no organisms, there are no pollinators, but those communities are very much changed. And so if I ask sort of what you can do, most people will say, well, what we should do is just plant more nice flowers. That's true. We should plant flowers in our own home landscapes, municipalities, corporations, government landscapes, et cetera. Anywhere you can plant them, you could, including things like trees and shrubs, not just these plants. But plants are not random. And this is actually a list of, this is a mix you can actually buy. And if I look at this mix, it's very clear that this mix is made for a very specific species. I can see these have very large flowers. Most of them are kind of in the red, purple range. And when I look at this as a pollination biologist who works very particularly with certain groups of insects, I know that the species this is targeted towards is actually this species. This is actually a reproduction of, let's see, the Iceman, who was a natural mummified person found in the Tyrolean Alps, 5,000-year-old body that was found. This is a reconstruction, but I just love the look on his face because he looks so befuddled. Those plants that I showed you are great for humans because humans actually, we're very specific kind of organisms. Our closely related living relatives, the primates, evolved a third cone in their eye, which allows us to see red. Other kinds of mammals, most don't see in the red range. We do. We tend to really like red things and purpley things that sort of in that range of, sort of in the other range on the other side. We tend to like those kind of colors. We also like very large flowers. And so when we go and we purchase flowers, that's what we purchase and that's what people grow and market to us. And that's what's in these mixes. But what happens if you want to make a landscape for a different species? And it's something like this syrphid fly. Obviously, this fly is very different from a human being. And what kind of plants would this organism like? And obviously for this organism, it's not just for beauty, it's also for survival. They get their nutrition from these plants. And for that very specific species of syrphid fly, these are the plants they go to. Now, of course, these plants, if you look at them, they're not what most people would put in their gardens. They're little flowers, little yellow flowers, and some don't even look like flowers to most people, little white flowers, and oftentimes they don't smell very good. And to most people, they would seem very weedy. You know, if you wanted to make a garden for this fly specifically to support it, this is what you would need to plant, not those plants I showed you before. So the real question comes is sort of why this is and how we can make landscapes that are both enjoyable for humans, as well as important and it's something that insects can actually use to survive. So I want to tell you a little bit about insects. I work on insects. I'm very interested in insect sensory systems, but insects are really weird. They're really unlike us. They're not as cute as us. They don't look as cute. They have these very large eyes that allow them to see oftentimes even behind them because they can see sort of 360 with these very large eyes, but their sensory systems are different. They can smell with like butterflies can smell with their front legs. They can, taste with their front legs. They smell with their antenna. They taste with their mouth parts. Insects mostly live in a chemical world where humans mostly live in a visual world. And so when we think about flowers, flowers are just really big advertisements to attract insects to them, both with a reward in the flowers as well as all these other things. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the particular things about flowers and plants. So I'll talk about advertisements, their structure, the visual, the chemical advertisements from flowers, as well as the rewards the insects get for visiting those plants. And then kind of break it down into parts. So of course you look at structure. Everyone knows that the structure of the flower allows the insect to be able to get inside or not. But for something like flies, they love structures like this common parsnip. A lot of little flowers all kind of bunched together in these umbel forms so they can crawl around from flower to flower. There's a lot of flowers, obviously. You can get a lot of seed set on one of these. But this is not, say, a hummingbird flower because hummingbirds hover, right? Those flowers can hang. These are for insects to land on and to crawl around, and they prefer these flowers in the landscape. Also for flies, I know most people don't think of fly gardens as pollinator gardens, but they're really neat. And I encourage everybody to have a fly garden. Hopefully I'll convince you. They also like larger flowers or larger inflorescence of flowers, so big bunches of flowers. They like little teeny flowers because they're small, but they like big bunches of flowers, and they like large patches, apparently. But also, it's quite interesting if you look at how organisms on this planet perceive the world, it's rather different from ourselves. So, of course, humans can see into the red range, as I was just describing, but we don't see into the ultraviolet. So we don't see the sun, say, through the clouds. Some insects can do that. In fact, many can. These are just different families of flies. And if you look at where the red lines are, it shows that even within flies, they see only certain parts of the spectrum. And if you look under the syrphid flies, a syrphidae at the very bottom, Aristalis, there's a number of species, even within species in the same genus of insect, see differently. They see different parts of the color spectrum, which means if you don't have flowers that are in that color spectrum, they won't really perceive them or necessarily engage them. Although insects have brains and they're smart and they can learn. So that makes it tricky for biologists because we know they have sort of innate preferences, innate things they can perceive, but they can also learn. If you look in flowers at nectar, so you think nectar is just sugar water, it's not. It's very complicated, and much of it has evolved with their pollinators to attract them and to reward them nutritionally. So everything matters, and when we research this, and I'll talk about some research in a second, we'd like to measure all of these different things in the nectar. The sugar type, sucrose, fructose, or glucose, the concentration of the sugar, the volume, the amino acid, what kind of plant compounds. Different kinds of honey had different flavors because those nectars have different kinds of what we call secondary plant compounds in them. Sometimes they're to attract insects, sometimes they're to repel them, prevent fungal growth, etc. So it's very complicated. But let me just give you a little insight into the patterns that we see and how we make our choices. So on one side of the screen, you'll see the monosaccharides, glucose and fructose, and the other side of the screen, just sucrose, when those two things are joined together. It turns out that short-tongued bees seem to have a preference for the monosaccharides, whereas long-tongued bees have a preference for the disaccharide or the sucrose. Flies seem to really quite like the monosaccharides, and you'll find that hummingbirds really do prefer things that are high in sucrose. And then if you look at families of plants, just at families, they'll favor one end of that spectrum or the other. Of course, there's a lot of individual plants, they do lots of different things, but this seems to be a general pattern. And some of you will be getting this. If you don't have the right group of plants with the right kinds of sugar, you won't have certain kinds of pollinators on them because they have certain kinds of preferences. So understanding this helps us make the decisions about what we might want to plant. If you just look at the volume, if you look at this, you see little things like little butterflies and little moths don't need a lot of volume, but things that are really large, like a bat or a hummingbird, actually have very high volumes of nectar in their flowers. In fact, bats pollinate things like agave and wild banana. They have a huge amount of nectar in them that you can almost take out with a spoon in those flowers. There's so much. And pollen, most people don't think about pollen. That's some research we've been doing to try to understand sort of the uses of pollen. Pollen, of course, is the way plants spread their gametes around and reproduce, right? And they use insects and other kinds of pollinators to help them do that efficiently. But pollen is a nutrition source. And if we look at different kinds of bees, say, many bees specialize on pollen. Bees are actually vegetarian wasps. Wasps feed their larvae caterpillars, as I'm sure Doug Tallamy has told you. But bees have seen the light and they've become vegetarians, and they feed for their protein, they feed their offspring pollen, or they use pollen to produce the resources that they need for their offspring. And there are different kinds of bees. Some go to a lot of different kinds of plants. We call those generalists. Some goes to a smaller group of plants. And then you can have highly specialized bees that only go to one kind of plant or a couple. But that's very uncommon. Mostly we see bees that go to lots of different plants or just a few. And that usually has to do with pollen specialization as opposed to nectar specialization. So this is some research that Anthony Valdeau did in our lab. And he looked at a bunch of different plants, native plants, and he looked at bumblebees. And he was very interested to see what their choice was and why they made different choices. And what he found is that the number one on this slide in this figure is American senna. He found that that was the most visited plant in the landscape for these bumblebees. And he did a series of tests, which I can't describe to you now because of time. But what it turned out is that the bumblebees first chose the American senna and exhausted all that pollen very early in the morning, and then switched to spiderwort, and then switched to Culver's root. And what it turned out is American senna had a ratio of protein to lipid that was 5:1. And it was their most preferred ratios. We did this experimentally in the lab and in the field, et cetera. And they really preferred this. And then they'd go to the next closest ratio. So it wasn't just protein, and it wasn't just the lipid in the pollen, which they can taste when they land on the flower. It is the ratio of those two things together. So what does this mean? This means that there are some plants like American senna that seem to have evolved as specialists for bumblebees. And they have very bumblebee characteristic kind of flowers, the shape of the flower, very typical for bumblebees. So that lets you know that the plants you choose, and if you really want to encourage, say, many species of bumblebee, maybe American senna is the choice you want to make. And so Anthony has gone on, and he's going to publish some things, I think, in the future. If we look at HB on this slide means honeybee, so that's the preferred ratio of protein to lipid for honeybees. BB is bumblebee. There are certain families of plant that have those ratios closer by. So if I wanted to create a landscape for honeybees versus bumblebees, I might choose different plants with different ratios of protein to lipid that were closer to the species I want. So that gives specialists, not necessarily everyone in their garden is going to do this, but it gives specialists the capacity to carefully select plants that will be very specific to things you want to support. Or you could spread out the different kinds of protein lipid ratio to support general pollinators. And this is certainly in terms of bees, which, as I said before, do specialize on types of pollen. Things like butterflies really only drink nectar. Flies tend to mostly only do nectar as well. So this pollen stuff is mostly to do with the life of bees, or the anthophila, the flower lovers. Now, this is all very complicated. I just told you a little bit about sort of the signals, the rewards, the color of the plants. Do they have the right color? Do they have the right nutritional rewards? And it's complicated depending on who comes to what plant, and seemingly impractical. How do you sort all this out? So I'm going to try to parse this for you so you can see how we have been thinking about this. So how do we do this? How do we do the science to really think about this and come down to making practical applications that are relevant to people like you? So I'll tell you about some experiments. We started working with cultivars of plants, and this is just sort of one example of salvia. There are two groups of salvia in the world. Natural world, there's a group that's for bees, and another group of salvia that have evolved for hummingbirds. Of course, salvia is a very beautiful plant to us, but you see they vary in color. So this is in series. So when growers grow plants to sell on the market, they tend to grow them in series, and they have variations, often variations in color, variations in shape. So you see here, if you look at just these kind of salvia, they vary in color. If you look at their stature, like Marcus is quite short, Caradonna is quite tall. Different morphology, by that I mean the shape of the flower. The flowers themselves are differing. And you also notice that display size can be very different. All of these things affect what pollinator comes to these. These plants are very handy to study. They're mostly inbred in the cultivar, so that controls genetic background, which is important for biologists. And so we can do some really nice studies with this plant. They tend to be very stable. In other words, if you go into a natural population of plants, they vary in many, many different ways because they're very individual, because these are all inbred. They're basically, you think of them as clones of one another. So the Caradonna will be a clone of itself, and the East Friesland will be a clone of itself. So they're basically all the same, and we can do great experiments with them. And that's what we did. So this is work of Emily Erickson. basically what, and she was a student here, she's now at Davis, now she's Dr. Erickson. She looked at the floral area of the plant, she looked at the plant height, she looked at the color, and of course, she measured all things to do with the corolla shape. This is a great deal of work, and Emily was quite intrepid doing this work as part of her PhD work. And I just want to show you this to show how much effort Emily put into this. These are all these different species of Echinacea, Agastache, Nepeta, Rudbeckia, and there's Salvia, and then all the cultivars. So there are 5 species groups, and then there are 5 cultivars within those. And you can see from this, she looked at color, height, floral area, corolla depth, etc., different characteristics of flowers. She looked at the nectar, the sugars, she looked at the pollen proteins, and she measured all of these and compared all of them between the groups. She looked at all the odors coming off the flowers, which is a lot of work to do. So she has what we call odor profiles of the smell of the flowers. As I said, insects live in a chemical world. They smell these flowers from a distance and close up. And so they make a lot of choices based on their smells. Flowers have smells not for humans, but for actually their pollinators. And I'm not going to parse this for you because it is a complicated experiment, a lot of work. But what I want to show you in this is if you look at the thing that most affected attraction, and if you look under the first column, you'll see taxa filters. You'll see that there's a picture of a bee on the top where the height is. It turned out for bees, the height of the plant really mattered in her system because she characterized all the pollinators that came to these plants at a couple of sites. You'll see that for color, for bees, then beetles, then flies, then butterflies, color differences of these different types were particular for those groups. It's not surprising that I told you before, say the flies liked a more yellow colored flower or a more whitish color. It turns out that for scent, flies and beetles like just a diversity of scent, isn't particular. But for butterflies in our system, sabinine was the most important compound coming out of the flower, etc. So we could talk about also the nutrition of these, but you can see it is very particular. Now, you say that's complicated to make choices of what plants I should put in my landscape, but what this lets us know is that if we wanted to breed plants that were not just attractive to you, we could also breed them to be more attractive to the pollinators because we know what characteristics they like. And thankfully, a lot of these qualities in our system match what we've seen in other research. So that makes us feel a little confident about what we were finding. But I encourage you to go look at Emily's paper. It was just published this year if you want to get into some really interesting details. This leads me to my first rule. My first rule for pollinator gardens is that identity of the plant you choose matters. This is something that I think Doug Tallamy has really driven home with a lot of people, that the family, the genera, the species, and in this case, the cultivar diversity of the plants is very important for who you attract, who you find in your landscape, who you're supporting. So identity of what you choose really makes a difference. And I have 4 other things I'm going to talk about, and I'll go through them much more briefly for the sake of time. And these are the rules we used to create the pollinators garden here at Penn State, which I'll also briefly talk about. You also need a high coverage of flowering plants. You need a majority of local species, but I'll tell you why that's different for, say, pollinators than it is for, say, caterpillars eating plants or herbivorous insects. The same broad rules hold true, but there's some differences. You need a pollinator relevant habitat composition, which I'll tell you about. It's a bit mysterious. And also consider your landscape context. No place is an island. What happens in your beautiful pollinator garden that you construct, your meadow, your field, your 10,000 acres, whatever you're doing, the landscape around it is going to influence what you do. And really, it's going to make your garden what it is. So let me say, high coverage of flowering plants. Now I'm just going to spot some of the data that we have that tells us that these are the engagements we must do to help pollinator diversity in human managed landscapes. Now, I'm not talking about restoring natural habitat. I'm not talking, because that's very specific, or saving rare species, which is a sort of a different game. This is for general managed human landscapes and the kind of interventions or the management practices, what informs those things. High coverage of flowering plants. There's a lot of data that shows that there is floral decline, as I said at the very beginning, in many parts of the world because of human activity. This is really great data from a paper that looked back a couple hundred years at specimens in the United Kingdom of bees. Each peak of this is a decline of a number of species of bee in the UK up until the end of the 20th century, starting in the middle of the 19th. And you can see that when guano, which is a natural nitrogen source, and there was rotation decline of cropping in the UK, you had a little spike. You have a spike when you have increased nitrogen with the synthetic nitrogen production. So increased nitrogen in the landscape can reduce your forb growth. Also, agricultural intensification in the 20th century around the First and Second World Wars, and then a little peak at the end of the 20th century, maybe involved with pesticide, we're not sure. It's clear that these landscape changes have led to a decline in floral resources. So both management practices, mowing, crop rotation, but also chemical inputs into the landscape have also led to changes in the floral abundance. This is a wonderful study, Baldock and al., that looked exhaustively at 4 British cities, at every place you could in a town where pollinators may live, where flowers may be. They look on man-made surfaces, pavement, the verge, which is the little space between the road and the sidewalk, cemeteries, natural reserves. And where you see more red, or more color in these pictures is where you see more robustness of the pollinator communities, which is a special measurement. But just think of it as you get more in the community. And you see the allotments in this are the places where you have more pollinators. And the reason probably is, and these allotments are these little sort of community gardens. They're like 5 by 5 feet or something in the United States, so very small, and or 10 by 10. You can grow different things. And these allotments are places where everybody's doing a bit of different things. So it's like a quilt work because humans are growing different things. I may be growing cabbages, you might be growing flowers, you might have an apple tree. That diversity in the landscape, the human choices just based on our taste and interest, has led to diversity in the pollinators there and the differences in those kind of communities, right? Majority of native species to your local area. So focus on the core generalist. I'm going to describe what I mean by core generalist here. So of course, your native species are going to be up with the timing of where you live. Pollinators need resources at different times because at certain times of year they're reproducing, at certain times of year they're dormant, they need energy for foraging. So their resource need changes over time as they grow. If they're, say, a bumblebee colony, they'll be growing and changing through the year, or even an individual solitary bee will need different kinds of resources, some very early in the spring and some later on. This is just from Anthony Vado, who I mentioned earlier. Each one of these little blocks of color is a different species of plant. And this is just over a time of day. So starting early in the morning at 9:30 and going till just after lunch, the insects are actually switching in the time of day what plants they go to. In this case, they're following their nutrition around for their pollen. And as they exhaust those plants, as I said earlier, on the American senna, they will switch to another plant that's the next closest. So even in the time of day, they're changing around. So not only do you want to have plants that bloom throughout the year, as you see in these regular kind of phenology maps that are sort of ever-looking gardening books, you see these, it's even going to be changing throughout the time of day. So you want to choose plants, of course, that go throughout your whole season. These are genera of different kinds of bees in Pennsylvania. There's actually data from Maryland, but it's for Pennsylvania in this part of the world. This is work by Sam Droege and Melanie Kammerer. What we actually have in this part of the world, and if you live in the desert Southwest, it's different. It's different depending on where you live in the world. But in our part of the world, if you noticed, just before May in this, there's a peak of different colors. You see a lot of different species like Nomada, you see andrenid bees. Pennsylvania, where I live, is a forest, mostly. And we have a whole season of bees, of particular kinds of bees, that are early spring bees that go to trees and shrubs that bloom early in the spring. The forest canopy here closes around the end of May. And by that time, the forbs, mostly the pollinator plants you think in the field, are growing, right? They really don't get going until July into August. And you have a totally different group of bees. So I like to say we have two different bee seasons in this part of the world. We have one in the early spring and one in the summer to the autumn, which means you should plant plants that are important for those bees at different times. So we really focus on our forbs in our gardens, but you really should think about planting great flowering shrubs and trees, of which there are wonderful many number, certainly of native ones. And they're easy to manage once established. They don't take as much work as, say, growing a meadow, which is just a heck of a lot of work. Pollinator community structure. Now, this is something I'm very interested in as a scientist, and I'm only going to breeze over this. There's a lot in here, and it's even a challenge sometimes for our graduate students to learn and understand this. But I just want to give you a flavor of our thinking about this, because it's quite important about how we make our choices and kind of what kinds of landscapes we want to create and maintain. Pollinators and their plants they go to are just in a food web. This is sort of like what you would know from middle school, sort of a food web, a sort of primary producers plants, and then you have things that eat the plants, and then things that eat the plants that eat the plants, right? Until you get really cool snakes and things like hawk predators at the very top of this food chain. Food chains are integrated. Pollinators live in a very special kind of food chain, not like this food chain. This is work from Laura Burkle in a real site in Carlinville, Illinois, a very important site historically for research on pollinators that is studied 100 years ago. Laura went back about a decade and more from now, back in 2013. She published this. But I just show you this. Don't worry about the colors and all those kind of things. But you see the Claytonia at the very top with the plant. That's what we would call the most generalized plant. Each colored box shows a different insect that goes to Claytonia. So you notice the Claytonia supports a heck of a lot of pollinators, where say the phlox near the bottom is supporting sort of fewer pollinators, less attractive. And the same goes for the bees. Bombus pennsylvanicus, which is actually disappearing in most of its range in North America. It's a very sad situation. But in this study was one of the insects that visited one of the most plants, whereas you go to the very other end, the things like Lasioglossum and the nemata at the other end of the figure, they only actually go to the Claytonia. So this tells you that the Claytonia is actually supporting the rare species that only go to one plant in this landscape. So think about this. If you were going to plant, you can't plant every plant. You can't plant 300 species in your landscape. You have to choose. For reasons of management and cost and availability and all those things. So if you're only going to plant a few plants, which would you choose from this list? Well, I would choose certainly the Claytonia as my top plant, because I say more bang for my buck. I plant the Claytonia and I can support a lot more pollinators. And maybe I plant the next 5 down on my list. That's what I call the core generalist plants. They're the ones who are going to support the most species of pollinator. Again, rare species of pollinator are usually living in quite rare habitats. They're not very mobile, et cetera. And in our human-built landscapes and managed landscapes, we really don't support those unless you're an ecologist, have a sort of a particular job. But most of us just want to support the general insects. We focus on these really beneficial plants. To make it a little more complicated, plants also are in what we call modular communities. This is actually data from a wonderful island in the Mediterranean, showing the different kinds of plants and bees that come to them. It's actually not just they go to a bunch of plants or just one. They actually are plants and insects in groups together. They reinforce each other and they go and they pollinate these plants together. And it turns out the plants themselves evolve characteristics that little cluster of bees that goes to that cluster of plants likes. So you have these little modular relationships. We like to illustrate it like this with these wonderful things. We also find in some of these groups there are connector bees or connector species. And if you're doing ecology and trying to understand a natural system, understanding who are the most connector species is important because you want the whole community to be connected. You understand who are the generalist species. So you can look at these communities in very different ways. And these are considerations we make when recommending plants for built and managed communities. You also need to have a pollinator relevant habitat composition. Let me explain. Of course, for bees, there are about 4,000 species of bees in the United States, continental United States. 3,000 of those live in basically the southwest, west of the Mississippi. 1,000 live east of the Mississippi. Most of our bees are ground nesters. So the kind of ground nesting habitat they need, the habitat they need is in the ground, about 70 or so percent. There's a group that are stem and hole nesters. They also need the kind of structures they need, such as old wood or tubes, some Joe Pye weed and things like that. In fact, we find, and in the study I just mentioned that Laura Burkle did, the bees that had disappeared at Carlinville were many of those bees that needed wood because those old trees had been cut down, not a surprise in many landscapes. We also have some cavity nesters. They're not common, so this is the managed honeybee. That lives in the cavity in trees, and there are not many wild ones that are not Africanized in the south, left because of varroa mite. But those kind of species also need sort of nesting habitats. And we don't think about nesting habitats, but that's also important if you're going to create a pollinator landscape. And I'll tell you a little bit of the things we've been doing here at Penn State to try to understand how to do that better. This is a wild bee house in Munster in Germany. It's one of the nicest ones I've seen, and you'll see something that looks very similar we tried to build here at Penn State. It's nice because it's set back, it has a good roof on it, it actually has a back to it, so it's more thermally insulated in the wintertime because the bees will overwinter in these. And it has different kinds of nesting material. These are quite built in, so you can't really move them around. And you can see it's kind of, the bees seem to really like this one because it was kind of set into this kind of field with the plants sort of growing around it, and they seem to favor it. Ones sitting out in an open field don't tend to work very well. They should have some shelter all around them for a variety of reasons. People also can build very small ones. There's not good data on how to build these right. They do get diseases in them. We are concerned you'll have too much density if you build really giant ones and don't know how to manage it. So this is something we're hopefully going to do some research on to understand just how to do these and how to manage these, to give people recommendations on the best things to do in your place. This is a beautiful one I saw built in Leukerbad in Switzerland. You find these built throughout sort of Germanic areas of Europe. It's wonderful if you go hiking around, you see a lot of these. And so I sort of had to go and look at the base of this beautiful chalet. It's a very old chalet. And it was this gorgeous. This is 6 feet tall. It's amazing looking. And there were no bees in it. There was nothing, right? But if you looked up into the walls of these ancient and very beautiful houses, all the bees are living in the wood of the house. This goes to show that, whatever our best plans are, the insects often have different ideas. This was how the building was standing. You can even see holes in the side beside these windows. And these bees have probably been living there for centuries, for sure. Full of bees, all different kinds of species. Citing what you're doing, putting your bee nest sites in the right place is really important. And again, something we need to learn a lot more about. This is Manfred Assi in Ulm. He is showing, this is my wife, Christina Grosinter, who's also a pollination biologist. He's showing her how he created a site on the ground for these ground nesting bees, something we've tried to emulate here at Penn State. He basically removed a few inches of the soil, so it's much more stable, and you have very sparse vegetation of plants. I'm not going to go into the details of this. We're going to have some information on our website at Penn State so you can understand how to do this at home. But basically, you can create better nesting sites. There's like a matrix of stones here the bees seem to like as well. It's also on a slope. Spring bees like a warmer slope because it gets warmer in the spring, so they can be active. But you actually can create these in landscapes and I think manage them in a good way. But again, it's something we're trying to learn about. Also consider your landscape context. A little bit of research, if we're great on time here. This is another project that Emily Erickson did looking at annual plants. Annuals are not very attractive to a lot of pollinators. Perennial plants and nativars tend to be. But she looked at these, and I just want to show you this data really quickly. This is just a group of them. Again, it was a 5x5 study, 5 different species or species groups. And she looked at all the things that we usually look at. She looked at were they flies, which is Diptera, butterflies, Lepidoptera, Anthophila are the flower-loving bees, who came to the plants and how much they visited and all those things. I want to just show you this really quickly. This looks confusing, but bear with me a bit. If you just look at the lantana. If you look at the lantana, each one of those lines is a different cultivar. And site 1 and then site 2 are just two different sites. They're a few kilometers apart. They're very close, very similar places. But this is how many visitors we had to the plants. Now remember, these plants are basically clonal within their cultivar series. And so they're genetically not different within the actual cultivar, but they are quite different between cultivars. And you can see that, say, plant number 2, Rose Glow, was very attractive, had more abundance in 10 minutes of visitors than at site 1 than site 2. And you find different changes for different ones. But you see the pattern for the lantana is that they're just less attractive at site 2. It turned out at site 2, there were hawk moths that were hogging the plants and driving down the diversity of the pollinators at site 2. There were not hawk moths at site 1. So you had more abundance. And you see it heading in different directions for different things like marigolds, tangentes. At the pentas, they're all going in different directions. So what this means is where you are determines how much attraction you get to those plants. Sometimes there's a pattern to it, and sometimes it heads in all different directions, which is a really wonderful puzzle for biologists, but I think vexing for people who think the plant's going to do the same thing everywhere you go, and it won't, because it really depends on its community. Consideration of the landscape context. This is my last principle, and then I'm going to talk about the pollinator garden at Penn State. Research, there's been a lot of research to do with if we put pollinator plants in agricultural systems for pollination services to crops, does it increase yield of our crops, and does it increase pollinator diversity, things like that. This is a graph that scientists love. This just shows that the more flowers you put in of different species, the more pollinator richness you get. Yay, that's great. We put a bunch of different kinds of plants, you get a bunch of different kinds of pollinators. We love that. So that's very positive. So just plant a lot of flowering plants and you'll get more species. But we found, so the pink here represents a pollinator strip you may add into, say, an agricultural system, or a garden you may add to a landscape that basically is, just green lawns and green trees. We found that if you put a pollinator strip in a landscape that contains less than 1% natural habitat, so say it's the most agricultural part of the Central Valley of California, you're not going to get much effect, even if you spend $1 million on it, because there's really not much native stuff to come back and live in your new plot. It's too little and too far away. We also find, and this is the case in Pennsylvania, and this is represented by the green area, if you have a lot of semi-natural habitat, and that's the case in Pennsylvania, we have small farms in very heterogeneous landscapes, little forest, little old field, a stream runs through it. It's very mixed habitat. We already have a lot of pollinators, so we put in our $1 million strip, and we really get no benefit because they're already living in the landscape. So for many of our orchardists here, it's really a question of better managing your landscape. You don't need to bring the flowers in. Maybe you add a few, but you really don't need to put those strips in. We find that the magic spot is between 1 and 20%. So if you have more than 1% semi-natural habitat, but less than 20, then you can see a very strong effect of adding a strip in, right? But that's certainly for things like agricultural applications, but it really lets you know that some places are really going to benefit from adding pollinator flowers, and other places less so. And some places it might be quite a challenge without a lot of serious changes to the landscape. So moderate landscape use can maximize the richness of your species and the abundance of your species, very general ecological principles. All right, you say, okay, Dr. Patch, that's a lot of information. My brain is full, I've heard enough. I need to take a nap now. So how do we build a landscape like this? It's really important for, if you're a pollination biologist, I've worked on genomes and I worked on brains and things like that in insects, and we don't get phone calls about genomes and brains. People are really interested in pollinators, people in government, people in business, just the general public. It's extraordinary to be a scientist and work on these things, especially at a time when, in 2007, this became a very big concern. Because it's really important for us to get the message out there, the best practices to do, how to manage those things, how to engage those. So we want to know how to create these landscapes that we've been trying. I don't design landscapes. I'm a scientist, but I do work with people who do. So here at Penn State, we wanted to build a bird and pollinator garden. We work with a number of people, and I could tell you wonderful stories about working with this. Really, it's a huge pleasure to work with this team. Didier Studios, Emmanuel Didier was the lead. Like Flato worked on many of the structures in our garden, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to really talk about who I most spent time with, which was Phyto Studio, which is Thomas Rainier and Claudia Vest. I mostly work with Claudia on this project as a scientific advisor, and Claudia as the designer, who really made a very complex challenge really work. It was quite extraordinary. The garden had to be about beauty and enticement. It's not just about supporting pollinators, although that was one of our grid intents. It had to be something people also found beautiful. We want them also to emulate these gardens in their own landscape. And I should say, we didn't want to also preach the choir. There's a contingency of people who always love native plants, and I love native plants, but we want other people to grow better plants as well. People who don't, traditionally want to have a bunch of wild native things growing in their yard. So this is just a view of the garden. It's only a couple years old now. It's really kind of brand new. I'll describe some of the aspects of how this garden is put together rather quickly, because we're sort of coming to the end of our time. This was built from the science up. We did not start with an intent. I literally showed a list of plants that came from research that I knew were good for certain pollinators, focusing on those core generalists in habitats similar to central Pennsylvania. Our commander's intent, again, was to focus and support all the pollinators, both for the flowering plants, for nectar and pollen, as also butterflies, host plants, and all that in this garden. Claudia took one look at my list and she said, oh, that's a forest, that's a glade, that's a dry meadow. And so she started organizing the plants this way. They're not facsimiles of those habitats, which is probably not quite successful all the time in a garden. They are interpretations of that. And this garden is, of course, a lot more florally rich and diverse than any natural place in the world. It's quite extraordinary. There's over 350 different species of native plants in this garden, as well as a lot of some of the best non-native plants. And these were our goals. So this was a distillation of our goals. And you can see these are the rules I was showing you earlier, plus other things. Claudia took these and made this into a design. And organize the plants in a way that we supported all the points I just talked about. So all the science I talked about is implicit in this garden and its organization, but it had to have big goals. We wanted it to be a place where people just discovered the world on their own. They just enjoyed it. It was very beautiful. We are an academic institution. We like to educate people, but we also want to facilitate change more broadly. It had to read as a garden for human beings. It couldn't be a wild place of just crazy plants. So it had to read as a real garden. It had to be very diverse to support those pollinators. And the design that Claudia chose was a community-based design based on interactions. The plants are not stuck in place like specimens. They will, over time, in their sort of wetland areas, in the sandy areas, kind of move around, reseed themselves. So the management is very important of this, which I'm not going to go into, but it's really more about editing the plants than it is maintaining them as they are. Of course, we want to keep the species around that we liked, and a number of them were hard to maintain. We had to sort of derive them from nature. 351 species here. There will be more as time goes on and this kind of changes and grows. We organize it around major groups of pollinators. And our one vertebrate pollinator here, the ruby-throated hummingbird, we provide a lot of plants for those because we love them and they're beautiful. Lots of woody plants. This is just the list on one side here, the plant list that I gave Claudia. She vetted it for, is it garden worthy? Is it attainable? Is these the right conditions to grow them in? And she parsed them down, focusing on those most generalist plants. And she divided that up into these areas. Starts at one side. So the side that's most green is more of a wild type garden. And as you move down in what looks like an insect wing, becomes a human landscaped garden. All the way at the very end are pots that if you only have a terrace, you live in New York and you want to grow some pollinator plants, you can do it because there's some that do well in pots and can grow in those places. The way this is done is that it is layered. There is a ground layer to get as much pollinator plants as we want in a square meter. There's a ground layer that acts like a living mulch. There's a middle layer, and I'm generalizing here, but there's a middle layer that contains a lot of those plants that are great for pollinators, but not really great for humans. They're kind of yellow or funny or smell bad. And then there's a structural layer with big, showy, bright, great plants that human beings love. So when you look at it, you go, wow, that looks like a beautiful garden. And so Claudia used this design to get a ton of plants in a small area and to create a very large amount of diversity. It also means management challenges. And this is just an idea. We also, this is not a garden just of native plants. To give it early interest in spring, we don't have these bulbs in North America. They're all European or old world, but they're put in the garden so it has some interest in the spring. I look at these to see if any pollinators come to them, but few do at this time of year, because again, here it's trees and shrubs, but they're added there for human interest because it should be enticing to humans. And then you can see different seasons and different parts of this planting. So it kind of blinks in, right, in different places. And even in this time of year, it's a 4-season garden as everything is dying, senescing, it's turning brown. I think this is even maybe one of the most beautiful times of year in the garden, as all the plants are dying out, because the structure of the plants is also very important. In our middle meadow disc, it's basically all the plants have senesced, but the New England aster, which looks like in that brownness, just looks like just this purple dust. This is a view of the garden in high summer. This is from a different angle. We have a vegetable garden, which people really do love, to the side you can't see. There are different soil types. Every soil is engineered in this garden. In the single central meadow disc, there is rooftop soil. That is to constrain the nutrients so the native pollinator plants don't grow too tall and become unlegible. This is kind of what it looks like in the very early spring with some of those bulbs coming up. That's the rooftop soil. This is what it looks like a bit later on in the central disc, sort of moving along. You see those very charismatic plants. In some of the pictures, you saw images of this structure here. This is actually a bee observation house. It's constructed so sunlight never hits this glass box with honeybees in them, and they can fly in and out of this, their natural living. They've done super well. We're very proud of this. The sunlight can never hit the glass box at any time of the year it's open, and there's an oculus at the top. So if the sunlight hits them, of course, they'll cook inside their little glass box. They did so well, they swarmed twice this year. Our beekeeper has a hard time keeping up with them, but this is a wonderful addition. We also have those this looks like the one I showed you in Germany. We're experimenting with these to try to see what's best. You see there's some wood here with no holes. That's because we try to reduce the density of who's nesting in this, because we're worried about disease. The garden has 1,000 stories, which I'm not going to tell you about, but all the plantings are not just beautiful. It's program stories about everything from the history of pollination science, current studies. There's an Emily Garden here too, showing her research plants, host plants for butterflies, black swallowtail butterflies, all sorts of different stories of pollinators and birds as well. This is the vegetable garden, which we try to teach people about pollination services to all the vegetables we love and all the interesting ethnographic history, all the plants that humans have. This is just a wonderful plot showing the combination. It's so beautiful. And it's just little Apiaceae. These are non-native, but they're host plants for black swallowtail butterflies that the black swallowtail loves, although they're not native. And it prefers the fennel, the feniculum, over the wild carrot. So why is that? We can talk about that. We can look for things on the plant. So it's tons of things are built in here. So I encourage you to come and visit. I hope there are questions.
Wow, Harlan, thank you. It's so wonderful. I wish that we could all meet out there with you and really walk through and see those plants in
that would be fun.
Up close and personal. Really wonderful. And I love all the elements you've added in: the honeybee hive, the bee hotel, and the hardscape, as well as all the plant dimensions. So really fascinating. We've got some good questions for you. Folks, it's almost the top of the hour, so if you need to hop out, remember we'll keep the recording going so you can come back and listen to some of those questions. I did want to comment on the bee hotel. I think you were in Germany or Switzerland talking about the structure on the side of the house, and then how they lived actually in I thought that was a nice take on them living in the hotel versus in the hotel that we built for them. And there was interest in the Q&A box from folks who can't wait to hear some of those recommendations you'll have about best practices. I think people like to add in those elements, but we don't want to be a killing field by high density of the residents, as well as places where pathogens are building up. So I do want to mention that a couple people asked about Emily Erickson's papers, and those are both on our website. So Harlan passed those on to me, and I've posted those under the Learn With Us on our website. So you can access both of those papers that were mentioned. And then Harlan, maybe you and I can talk off camera about possibly getting a PDF of your talk that we could post, because you had so many great charts and graphics, and people were really interested in being able to, spend some time with the details of those. So we can talk about that before we go.
Sounds good.
People are always interested in cultivars of native plants, and I wonder if we could have kind of your take on cultivars, that whole big question.
Yeah, so it's a big question, and in some groups it can be get quite exciting conversation. The short answer is, things are different. As I was trying to sort of give you a flavor that there are a lot of differences, and we've learned that we can't just assume we know what's going to happen. Even when you have your native plant, right? So that native plant you grow, say I have an echinacea like this. I have an echinacea, I go and it's in my native plant, I buy it. That actually is just one plant that somebody walked in a field and pulled out of the ground. And if you walked around the field, and Emily, as a scientist, had gone around and measured all the plants in the field, she'd have found very different things. So it's only one individual representative that essentially just gets cloned and given to people, right? So we found in some studies that actually what people call the native plant is actually less attractive than some of these cultivars that are derived from that species, right? To different things, right? Some cultivars in Emily's study, if you look at the details, attract nothing. So if you want to support biodiversity, I would not plant those ones. They don't really attract very many things. General patterns, there are general patterns, and I think over time we're going to sort this out. Annuals, many of the annuals that bloom for a long time actually the pollen has been bred out of them for a variety of reasons. And they tend just not to be very attractive to most species. They don't connect the network of pollinators. Annuals tend not to. So we would like to grow better annuals that are just better supporting, that do all the things that annuals people like in gardens. The perennial plants, especially the nativar ones, it's not going to be a surprise, support many more pollinators and seem to connect the network better, right? So that's just rules of thumb. But we hope we can have a way for when people, when they have flower trials and the cultivars come out different every year. You can't get the cultivar from 5 years ago this year of any kind of plant. It's a challenge. So hopefully in flower trials, we have a methodology that we think they can add into their flower trials. When they judge, how much disease, how long does it bloom before they put them on market, but they can also assess pollinator attraction, and that can be added. We know from market studies that people will pay more money for like a $7 plant if it's pollinator attractive, and they know that. But we'd like to put some real numbers behind it so we can say which cultivars are the best and which aren't really useful if that's your goal and purpose.
Well, I really like that one of the criteria that Claudia used in working on those designs was, are the plants garden worthy? Because yes. I think, there are a lot of great native plants that are attractive to pollinators, but you put them in a garden bed, and unless you're the right kind of gardener who's a little more loose maybe and doesn't mind a little bit of chaos, they're not necessarily garden worthy, and they're not going to convince the neighbor or the garden club that those are good plants to plant. And
perfect example is just going over here is Canada goldenrod, native plant, great plant, but if you put it in your yard, that's all you're going to have. I mean, it's very aggressive. It's going to take over. You're going to have a monoculture. So there are certain plants for a whole host of reasons are not very garden worthy, right? So that's certainly one example. Yeah. So she really did try to make sure that they were relatively easy to manage and good. She really thinks about who's a good neighbor to what plant, right? It's really important for your native plants. Who are good neighbors?
Right. And I like you added that dimension of change, because those landscapes are changing. They're not constant. Plants are moving and reseeding and so on. As
everybody knows, that's our challenge, is we have all these native plants and they want to go live somewhere else. That's their thing.
So out of the about 2,500 people on the webinar this morning, quite a few people are fly garden fans and asked,
yay!
Kind of maybe talk, or I don't know if it's easy to pull that slide back up, but if you could talk about some of the plants that you think are great for flies.
I actually have an entire fly garden talk I can give. They love the Apiaceae. So things in the carrot family are plants that they love. So we plant a lot of those. But a real rule of thumb for flies is just what I showed you. If it has little flowers, if they're yellow and white, If they smell a little bit bad in a variety of ways, you can probably bet flies will enjoy them, right? They really like early in the spring, at the very ends of the year, or as you go up in altitude, you'll find a lot more flies. If you go up in the Alps, things like Edelweiss, these are fly flowers. See very few bees, because bees have good reputation because they like to be in warm places, just like butterflies on sunny days. But flies will fly at the very cold times of year at higher altitudes. And many of those plants you find at the very early part of the year, at the very end, and at cold times of day, sort of towards the evening, you'll find a lot of flies on those plants. They also like water. I can't go into it now, but many flies, especially the flies that go to flowers, many of those flies need water for their life cycle. Not the flower flies straight up like the bombyliids, but other ones like syrphid flies. So you tend to find more flies in very wet places. If you live near a swamp, I grew up near a swamp in Virginia, a lot of flies. They like wet places, and they don't tend to be around drier upland sites as in profusion.
Okay. You mentioned in the Penn State Garden design that you were talking about low growing plants, or kind of creating that foundational layer. I wonder if you have some favorite low growers for pollinators.
So that's the thing. You have to come and see them because they're great. There are quite a number in the garden. So in the drier areas, that sedges are used to do this. If you look at Claudia Vest's design, her and Thomas have a book, I think, Planting in a Post-Wild World, where they talk about the plants. So the sedges are really great because in the areas where they're sandy, where we want to encourage ground nesting bees, they don't get super dense, but they kind of control some of the weediness and put some structure in the ground, because the bees need some structure. We have a fair amount of strawberry, wild strawberry, and it turns out that the leaf cutting bees, that when they make their little sections between their little chambers, when they lay their eggs, they love to cut this wild strawberry, which grows as a beautiful ground cover. And if you go in our garden, it looks like somebody's taken a hole punch and gone through all the plants and poked holes. That's another challenge in a garden in which you encourage herbivory. You encourage, if we use world milkweed, the butterflies eat it to the ground. So I have to go pick off butterflies. I don't want to sort of mess with my karma and taking the butterflies off, but they just eat our plants to the ground. So you got to really kind of figure out how to manage it. Same goes with some of these ground covers. Some of the bees really love them. And it switches throughout the time of year.
Okay, there's a question about is there evidence the upsurge in native habitats popularity has started to help pollinator populations? And I wonder, we're kind of in the choir here, where a lot of people are interested in those native plants. Are we doing good, and can we measure that scientifically?
So I showed you some of that data from Europe, so the intervention of just putting in plants. So if you're saying adding native versus non-native has been tested to encourage them, I don't know of a study that has done that directly. I can certainly say from a lot of people's work that would be definitely clear. We know that you get more for one than the other. That's for sure. It's a question of landscape. It's a question of what you can manage. So you can't live you can, because they have the High Line in New York, right? You can manage that, which is sort of more diverse than a traditional kind of garden. If people are familiar with the High Line. You can have more places like that, but you need an army of people to manage it. So it's really, for me, a question of management. So yes, if you put a bunch of native plants in a place where you get more diversity, over time you will. You won't get it like that if you put it in a very built up area or super aggy. As I was saying, it just won't happen. It's not magic. It has to do with the landscape around it, right? So basically I say, follow these rules. The first thing is, if you know nothing, just plant more flowers, just as many as you can get in, because I know you're going to hit some really good ones, just planting more. If you can, management wise, given the restrictions of whatever you're doing, because in cities, say, there's lots of concern with like vermin and trash, and there's all sorts of things that go into this. But if you can, plant more natives. Just listen to Doug, tell me, and just do more natives. It's going to be really great. And be smart about what you plant, right? Plant really good ones that really are attracted to a lot of diversity. That's sort of the step I say go through. Then you can add the structures in and water features and all that. But it's kind of a hierarchy. I would just like it if people everywhere would plant more plants, and it'd be like the culture of flowers. I mean, that's a good thing in the world, right? For everybody. People can get behind that.
We could use more flowers.
Exactly.
You mentioned management. Let's end with this question that always comes up this time of year where people are thinking about, at least in the Midwest and Northeast, kind of putting their gardens to bed. I'm wondering if you have suggestions for how you manage that pollinator habitat there in the Arboretum to allow for overwintering for many of our insect and other species.
I'm glad you asked that question. This, like the nest site, is a real question we have. And I've told you about things we know, but we really don't know the management in a way we'd like to know it. So what is encouraged? So in this particular garden, we actually don't cut it down till the very end of winter, right? We leave all those because we want the insects to nest in sort of the interface with the ground and the plants, and some in the plant stems. So we're really trying to think about what the best management practices are. Part of the garden we actually don't even cut down till later, right? Till you've got some growth growing, but that's tricky because you've got your plants growing, it's your old growth. You've got to clean that out. It's not very attractive in a public place to leave that just going and going. So it's a real challenge. I've been quite impressed with the horticulturalists trying to figure out how best to do this to increase the diversity. And we are measuring who lives in the garden, how it's changing over time, and all those kind of things. And we have different sections that we're trying to do different things. But my rule of thumb would be don't cut until the very end of winter. Before you see the green growth come out, then you can cut down. And if you have a place, I would pile all your sticks and brush up in a certain area, right? If you have a sort of a more wild area in which to do that. I do that in my own garden, and keep that brush around. I also get lots of groundhogs and chipmunks and all sorts of interesting folks living in that. So yeah, it's always a challenge. When you're managing an ecosystem, it is always idiosyncratic, particular, and there are no general rules that are above real practice on the ground.
Great. Harland, thank you so much, folks.
Thank you.
Have put thank yous into the chat box. I know Harland will appreciate that. Harland, for your time and your expertise, all the work that you're doing there at Penn State. Thank you so much for being part of this webinar series.